All right, I think it's all right to get started. Um, so I just want to start off by saying it's an honor to be here at this convention among esteemed comrades and friends. My name is Tunde Osazua, and I'm the coordinator of the U.S. Out of Africa Network, which is a formation of activists and organizers and individuals and organizations, really, um, that are committed to achieving the complete withdrawal of US and NATO forces from the African continent, achieving the demilitarization, right? Like when I say demilitarization, I'm speaking about Western influencer driven militarization of the continent and the closure of all foreign military bases throughout the world, like, US military bases throughout the world. So, the network is the driving force of the Black Alliance for Peace's US out of Africa shut down AFRICOM campaign. And so, yeah, today I'll be speaking on military engagements and humanitarian efforts as impediments to self determination, which for me is really just another way of saying the obvious, right? That the militarization by the West of the African continent, which has taken place, or been driven or carried out rather by neocolonial governments, is an obstacle to self determination and African liberation. And so, in order to speak about this at length, I'll be engaging with this US EU NATO axis of domination, right? And so, in the Black Alliance for Peace, we say that, the US EU NATO death toll inflicted on the African continent makes any claim of concern for humanitarianism and human rights hypocritical. And that's usually what they use to kind of justify their interventions, their, meddling, their subversion. Um, and so, we call for the dismantling of NATO, AFRICOM, and all neocolonial imperialist structures, right? Africa and the rest of the world can't be free until all people have a right to sovereignty and the right to live free of domination. So I just want to start out with that. So, just to get into NATO a little bit, you'll probably know this history, but it was founded in 1949 after World War II, at a time when African countries were still under the yoke of colonialism, right? Most of the original founders of NATO had been Africa's principal colonizers, right? So we're talking about the United Kingdom, France, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and the USA, right, as the lead, NATO organizer and the dominant partner in this military alliance. And to this day, like at the current moment, NATO is a huge global axle in the wheel of the military industrial complex, which includes more than 800 US military bases around the world and bases or relationships with almost all African countries, right? As it says here, there are 53 out of 54 African countries have military to military relationships with the United States. So that, that's basically everyone, but I think Eritrea, right, which doesn't have a relationship with AFRICOM. And Egypt has a relationship with CENTCOM, right, which is the Central Command, another US military command. Um, so, we understand that through these partnerships, right, like through these relationships, there's a relationship of a neocolonial relationship, really, right, where the U.S. is able to dominate um, and control a lot of the functioning of these militaries in these countries, right, and they're in pursuit of full spectrum dominance, and they're driven by they being the elite in the U.S. are driven by a ferocious appetite for corporate capital, or that's their appetite. So, just to get into some specifics, right? Because that was um, a little more general. I wanted to speak on some particular sites of intervention, particular sites of U.S. meddling, and that I guess speak to how this functions, how the U.S. uses humanitarianism to achieve its ends, right? And so I wanted to start out with something that I think has been talked about a lot, but I think is very useful in terms of the lessons that we get on how, US imperialism, NATO imperialism functions. And that's, the US NATO destruction of Libya in 2011, right? So, um, it really just demonstrates how NATO and AFRICOM can work with other US Western dominated structures like the UN uh, uh, to accomplish their ends. So, for example, in Libya, in 2011, the UN gave political authorization for a no-fly zone and a blockade of Libya, supposedly to protect the citizens of that country, which really resulted in the destruction of Africa's most prosperous country at the time, with the highest human development index. The US led NATO forces launched a bombing campaign as a result that killed tens of thousands of civilians and brought about tens of billions of dollars in property and infrastructure damage. So this kind of shows how, US led NATO sometimes uses the UN for political cover, and it has no problem with illegally overstepping its UN mandate to commit its crimes against humanity and achieve its regime change goals. I actually want to spend some time on the lies of empire that were used to argue for humanitarian invention in Libya. So these myths were some of the most repeated claims by the insurgents and by NATO and European leaders and the Obama administration at the time, as well as the mainstream media and the International Criminal Court, so-called, uh, to justify the devastation that they were carrying out, right? And so I think we can look at how some of the reasons why these claims are better seen as imperial folklore rather, as they're myths that supported like the main myth, right? That the war on Libya was humanitarian intervention designed to protect civilians. Um, and I think the importance of the myths lies in their wide reproduction. They were spread far and wide. At the time, it was all of the mainstream outlets. I mean, I'm in the West. I'm in Atlanta, so I was, getting this like consistently, right? Like getting all of this messaging from the imperialists consistently. But it's that they threaten to, kind of distort the ideals of human rights and their future invocation. And human rights, I think, has a like a contested framework. But these myths kind of aided in distorting it further and brought about the militarization of society. So just to get into the first one, right? I think we could speak about like the genocide that they claim that the Libyan government was carrying out, right? So a few days in 2011 after the protests began on the 21st of February, uh, the Libyan deputy permanent representative to the UN at the time, Ibrahim Dabashi, stated that we're expecting a real genocide in Tripoli. The airplanes are still bringing mercenaries to the airports. And that was the myth that was composed of myths. Like it was with that statement that they linked together three separate, ideas, that the role of the airports or the need for the gateway drug of military intervention, which is the no-fly zone. And then the second part of that myth, the role of mercenaries, meaning really just Black people, right? Like they spoke a lot about African mercenaries, which really just referred to any Black people in Libya at the time. Um, and then the threat of genocide, right, which was kind of geared towards the language of the UN's doctrine of responsibility to protect, which was and so his quote that I just read was uh, unsubstantiated absurd, but he was bringing together these different myths that kind of spoke to what the media was trying to push on us at the time. Um, and it was really grounded in racist discourse about Black Libyans or African migrants, because there are a lot of Africans from surrounding countries that had traveled to Libya on their way to, Europe, right, to escape, or to just in their travels, right? But we know that genocide has an established definition, like in the UN's 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. They say that it's persecution that involves or is targeting a specific national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And so not all violence is genocidal. Internecine violence is not genocide. Genocide is not just lots of violence, or violence against undifferentiated civilians. And so, what the assertion that Dabashi made uh, um, failed to do was to identify the persecuted national, racial, or ethnic or religious group, right? And so, obviously, like he was just myth making, and it was founded on prejudice. Um, but I think what we could also say is that the foreign and military invention was successful in enabling actual genocidal violence, right? Like it wasn't Gaddafi's forces, but rather the NATO, U.S., European forces, and their allies that were able to carry out horrific violence against African migrants and Black Libyans that were singled out solely because of their skin color, and it wasn't really stopped or apologized for, and the media even collaborated on asserting that any captured or dead Black person could be a mercenary, right? And so it's really just genocide that the white Western world carried out on Libyans, Black Libyans, and the folks in the media just skipped over it, right? They didn't even talk about the violence that NATO and the U.S. were carrying out, and I think we need to interrogate that. There's not enough interrogation of these things. The another myth I wanted to touch on, right? So that was the first myth, the myth of genocide. The second myth is that Gaddafi was bombing his own people, and one of the reasons why they rushed to implement a no-fly zone was to prevent Gaddafi from using his air force to bomb his own people, right? Which is, you know, um, was also used in the demonization of Saddam Hussein in the lead up to war in Iraq, right? So on February 21st in 2011, when the first, warnings of genocide were being made by the Libyan opposition, both Al Jazeera and the BBC claimed that Gaddafi deployed his air force against protesters to bomb them, right? And so, we there were reports of it, but they were unable to provide any sort of evidence, and so, actually, those claims that Gaddafi was using helicopters against unarmed protesters were totally unfounded. They're based on fake claims and pure fabrication. And I think it's an important myth or lie because it was Gaddafi's domination of the Libyan airspace that foreign interventionists wanted to nullify. And so, myths of atrocities perpetrated from the air took added value as they provided an entry point for foreign military intervention that went far beyond any mandate to protect civilians. Even David Kirkpatrick of the New York Times in March 21st confirmed that the rebels felt no loyalty to the truth in shaping their propaganda, claiming non existent battlefield victories and claiming they were still fighting in key cities after the Gaddafi forces had won that city, right? And so they were just making vastly inflated claims of Gaddafi's barbaric behavior, um, and that became imperial folklore, right, surrounding the events in Libya that suited Western intervention. So just another myth that helped them, carry out this war. Uh, um, and then a third myth is like the Benghazi angle, like they were talking about save Benghazi, and that was something that Barack Obama, who was the U.S. president at the time, spoke of. He said that Benghazi could suffer a massacre that would have stained the conscience of the world, right? And Obama with the UK Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, and the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, asserted jointly that by responding immediately, their countries halted the advance of the Gaddafi forces, and that the bloodbath that was supposed to happen had been prevented, and that tens of lives had been protected. And so, in that same vein, right, like French jets bombed a retreating column and killed ambulances and destroyed trucks. And, I think, the US was quick to dismiss claims when it suited their purposes, but there's no evidence that, what that shows that Benghazi would have witnessed the loss of tens of thousands of lives, as proclaimed by Obama, Cameron, and Sarkozy, and so it's just kind of like a false pretense, right? And so Gaddafi didn't plan a genocide in Benghazi, but we heard that Benghazi claim a lot at the time. Um, and so I think, what we can look to is that Gaddafi's acts were very different from what we saw in Rwanda, Darfur, Congo, Bosnia, and other killing fields. There's no video evidence, no graphic evidence of any massacres, and Gaddafi didn't threaten civilians or anything, as Obama alleged. And so, I think what we can point to is that, you know, um, uh, the NATO and the US and the Europeans and some folks in, like, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates took out, measures such as committing massacres in Tripoli, and supporting, the revenge killings that were being carried out by the Libyan opposition. um and so, I think the whole Benghazi myth is one to look at. It's just another example of imperial myth making. We can also touch on that, African. Oh, I see there are a lot of dope comments. Yeah, I'll definitely reach out about the BAT process. Um, yeah, but I think the next piece I wanted to touch on was African mercenaries, the myth of the African mercenaries, and the context that it like came up in, was written about by like Patrick Coburn, and he said, and I quote, "Since February, the insurgents, often supported by foreign powers, claim that the battle was between Gaddafi and his family on the one side and the Libyan people on the other. Their explanation for the large pro-Gaddafi forces in Libya was that they were all mercenaries, mostly from Black Africa, whose only motive was money. And as Patrick Coburn noted, Black prisoners were put on display for the media, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention, actually. But Amnesty International later found that all of the prisoners had supposedly been released, since none of them were fighters, but rather were undocumented workers from Mali, Chad, and West Africa. So this African mercenary myth was useful for the opposition to insist that this was a war between Gaddafi and the Libyan people, as if he had no domestic support at all, an absolute fabrication such that one would think only little children could believe a story so fantastic. So the myth is also useful for cementing the intended rupture between the new Libya and Pan Africanism, kind of realigning Libya with Europe and the modern world, which some of the opposition so explicitly crave. Um, the African mercenary myth is put into deadly racist practice is a fact that paradoxically has been both documented and ignored. Among the departures from the norm of vilifying Black Libyans that instead documented the abuse of these civilians were the Los Angeles Times, Human Rights Watch, and others who found no evidence of any mercenaries at all in eastern Libya, totally contradicting the claims presented as truth by outlets such as Al Arabiya and the Telegraph and Time and the Guardian, right? So this is like an extreme departure that Al Jazeera helped disseminate, but there was a single report focusing on the robbing, killing, and abduction of Black residents in eastern Libya. And so what we learned is that the racist targeting and killing of Black Libyans and African migrants was widespread throughout this war and even afterwards, right? That there was graphic evidence of rotting bodies of 30 men, almost all Black, and many handcuffed, slaughtered as they lay on stretchers, and even in an ambulance in central Tripoli. So that kind of reminds us of what happened a few weeks ago in Morocco with the African migrants who were, slaughtered by the Moroccan forces, that have been trained by AFRICOM. So I think, while we've seen videos of hundreds of bodies in the Abu Salim hospital, the BBC didn't really talk about how those victims or those who were slaughtered were clearly Black people, and didn't even address who might have killed them, right? There were reports that revealed that the insurgents engaging in the ethnic cleansing against Black Libyans, the insurgents calling themselves the Brigade for Purging Slaves, Black Skin, who vowed that in the new Libya, Black people would be barred from healthcare and schooling, from which Black Libyans had already been expelled by insurgents. Yet there was no really interrogation of that. And Human Rights Watch even reported that dark-skinned Libyans and Black African migrants face particular risks because rebel forces and other armed groups often consider them pro-Gaddafi mercenaries from other African countries. So, it's all sorts of atrocities being committed against these Black Africans. Um, and yeah, absolutely. British mercenaries did support the rebels via arms and direct fighting. Um, and so, yeah, there was even disproportionate detention of Black Africans that Amnesty International reported on. And this myth is just, maybe one of the most vicious of all of the myths, and definitely the most racist. Newspapers like the Boston Globe showed photographs of Black victims and Black detainees with the assertion that they must be mercenaries, right? Despite the lack of any evidence, and instead they were asserting that Gaddafi was known to have recruited Africans from other countries in the past without even bothering to find out if those shown in the photos were Black Libyans. And so, like, the lynchings that took place of Black Libyans, of Black Africans, migrant workers was continuous. And what we've seen is that you know the International Criminal Court didn't even bother to deal with this, right? And there has not been any sort of justice for these victims of these heinous crimes that basically constitute an ethnic cleansing or a genocide that they were claiming that Gaddafi was carrying out with no evidence. There are two more myths I want to get into. There's or a couple more. There was a myth on that Viagra fueled mass rape, right? That there was somehow, like, Viagra was uh, 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 being given to Gaddafi's troops and causing them to go on a rape spree, and folks are really taking this myth seriously. They were writing to Pfizer to get them to stop selling Viagra to Libya because it was being used as a weapon of war. And people who should have known better, were doing things like this. And this myth was used to deliberately misinform the international public. And the Viagra story was first reported on in Al Jazeera in collaboration with some of the rebels in Libya who had been supported by the Qatari regime that funds Al Jazeera. So, it was then kind of spread throughout Western media. Even, the former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Luis Moreno Ocampo, appeared in the world media to say that there was evidence that Gaddafi distributed Viagra to his troops in order to enhance the possibility of, these types of war crimes, this rape and sexual assault. And so I think, when we think about how they fabricated these lies that Gaddafi ordered rape or distributed Viagra to enhance the possibility of rape, and that it was, like, well respected officials that were spreading these lies. I think it's kind of startling, but even U.S. ambassador at the time to the UN Security Council, Susan Rice, asserted the same lie that Gaddafi was supplying his troops with Viagra to encourage mass rape, and she didn't offer any sort of evidence to back up her claim. And U.S. military intelligence sources were sometimes contradictory, but the fact that even former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, was spreading this claim as well is concerning. But I think it just speaks to the lengths that um, the U.S. EU NATO axis of domination will go to bring about consent or to provide the justification to its people for this war making and this destruction. I think maybe the biggest myth, or like one of the more important ones, is responsibility to protect, right? And so like I mentioned earlier with the genocide, the impending genocide that they were claiming that was going to take place at the hands of Gaddafi's forces. It was easier for Western powers to try and invoke, the UN 2005 doctrine of the responsibility to protect. So, it's not clear that by the time the UN Security Council passed that resolution that they called 1973 or 1973, that the violence in Libya had even reached the levels seen in Egypt, Syria, and Yemen. But the most common refrain used against the critics of this doctrine of humanitarian intervention is that just because the West can't intervene everywhere doesn't mean it should not intervene in Libya. But we know that this is just a tool of these imperialists, right? This is a tool that is used to sustain neocolonialism, right? And so, even the earliest critiques of like the responsibility to protect doctrine, who voiced their concerns at the UN, talked about this issue of selectivity. I'm of the opinion. I think we as a collective are of the opinion that the doctrine is unfounded, that the UN and is kind of, like I was saying earlier, being used as a tool to you know um, dominate the rest of the world in these ways. And so I think when we speak about the myth at work here is, and that myth is that foreign military invention is guided by humanitarian concerns, right? So in order to kind of buy into that myth, we have to, ignore some key realities, right? We have to ignore the new scramble for Africa, where, Chinese interests are seen as competing with the West for access to resources and political influence, which AFRICOM and other, US military commands around the world are meant to challenge, right? Gaddafi challenged AFRICOM's intent to establish military bases in Africa, and AFRICOM became involved in the Libyan intervention, specifically through Operation Odyssey Dawn, which Horace Campbell argued, and Horace Campbell was a great scholar. He was speaking about how U.S. involvement in the Libyan bombing, it was turned into a public relations ploy for AFRICOM and an opportunity to give AFRICOM credibility under the facade of Libyan intervention. Um, we could also speak about how Gaddafi's power and influence on the continent had been increasing through aid, through investment, and a lot of projects that have been designed to lessen African dependency on the West and to challenge Western multilateral institutions by building African unity, which made him a rival to U.S. interests, right? So that's one thing we could ignore, the whole scramble for Africa piece. The other another thing we could ignore, we would have to ignore, right, to buy into that lie or the myth that you know um, foreign military intervention is done for humanitarian concerns, is that we that anxiety on the part of Western capital or Western multinational or corporate interests, right, over Gaddafi's supposed resource nationalism, what they called it at the time, right? So he was threatening to take back what oil companies had gained. And so they were really anxious, and there was, kind of a rush into Libya on the part of those corporations to scoop up the spoils of victory once they were able to, depose Gaddafi and sow all sorts of chaos. They ran in and kind of ravaged the country and took all of its rich resources. And it's not just oil that's in Libya. They have tons of different types of resources. But I think yeah, I appreciate that comment. It is a powerful tool, and yeah, I think we need to be looking at that Russia-Ukraine war as another vehicle for in terms of how they're able to utilize this propaganda tool. So I appreciate that comment. But I think what we know about Gaddafi's so-called resource nationalism is that it was used, like his revenues from the different resources that they had, is used to support greater African economic independence, and it was also used in many cases for backing national liberation movements that challenge Western hegemony. The third piece on this whole idea of myths or things we had to ignore to buy into the myth of humanitarian intervention is that I think that you have to ignore the fear in the U.S. that there was kind of less control over the Arab revolution, right? And so, I mean, how can, like, those realities, I think, are stark, and they really point to um the fallacies of this whole idea of, humanitarian concerns. And if it was human rights that mattered most, then, why can't we look at the terrible track record of NATO and US human rights violations, not just in Libya, but basically everywhere they go, right? We could look at Afghanistan or Iraq or Kosovo and Serbia, right? So that humanitarian angle is not credible or even logical. Um, and yeah, so the responsibility to protect is just a myth that kind of achieved the opposite of its stated aims, right? It brought about a humanitarian crisis in Libya of, wild proportions, right? So, I think, we could look at, the role of Qatar and the UAE in bombing Libya and aiding the insurgents as they backed, Saudi military intervention to crush the pro-democracy protests in Bahrain, um, and all of those things. But I think, what we should really be pointing to is the role of NATO and AFRICOM, and not only willfully failing to protect civilians in Libya, but also, kind of deliberately targeting them in a manner that's basically amounts to terrorism, right? By most definitions that the West uses. So, we know NATO admitted to deliberately targeting Libya state television and killing three of their reporters, in a move that was condemned by international journalist federations as a direct violation of a 2006 Security Council resolution banning attacks on journalists. A U.S. Apache helicopter, and a repeat of the infamous killing shown in the collateral murder video, gunned down civilians in the central square of Zawiya, killing the brother of the information minister, among with others, taking a fairly liberal notion of what constitutes command and control facilities. NATO also targeted a civilian residential space, resulting in the deaths of some of Gaddafi's family members, including three grandchildren. So, I mean, all of this points to the fact that they don't care about protecting civilians like they claim to. Um, and the major news media often kept silent about these civilian deaths caused by NATO bombardments, obviously, um, and responsibility to protect was invisible, essentially, when it came to civilians that were targeted by NATO and AFRICOM. So, I mean, all of those things could be, I guess, considered international criminal offenses, but obviously we never see, Western, um, um, governments in this way being targeted by, those bodies. But I think, we could also look at the reports we have of NATO and AFRICOM ships and ignoring the distress calls of refugee boats in the Mediterranean that were fleeing Libya. For example, in May of 2011, there were 61 African refugees that died on one of those boats, despite making contact with, you know, ships that belong to NATO member states. So, there was a repeat of that situation in early August when dozens died on another vessel. And on AFRICOM and NATO's watch, at least 1,500 refugees fleeing Libya, uh, more than that, had died at sea since during the war. So, those were mostly Black African migrants. So, and I think, we can also see that responsibility to protect was absent for those folks as well. So, it in contrast, NATO and AFRICOM kind of provided a shield for, the Libyan opposition and the insurgents who were victimizing unarmed civilians, um, in areas they came to occupy. And there was no hint of the responsibility to protect doctrine there in those cases. They also assisted the rebels in starving Tripoli of supplies and subjecting the Tripoli civilian population to a siege that deprived them of water, food, medicine, and fuel. Um, and in contrast, like the international media, went after Gaddafi when he was accused of something similar in Misrata. Uh, uh, And so, this obviously all this logic is one-sided. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit on the responsibility to protect doctrine, and how that factors into the war propaganda. Um, yeah, I think the Ukraine examples is important, as far as, like, how there were some Africans that did serve in Ukraine, and I think they're also victims of this tool, of you know myth making. Um, but I mean, it's interesting because a lot of African countries were willing to, or were not willing to condemn Russia. A lot of those leaders were not fooled by um, the lies of empire. But I think, I just want to touch on one last myth, as it relates to this Libyan situation. Um, and it's really just kind of about how the war was like, they try to portray this war on Libya as a victory for the Libyan people. And what we know is that Gaddafi had a solid base of support in Libya that he was able to rely on. In like February of 2011, a week after, I think, the first street protests, what we saw is that uh, uh, there was, the French government had decided already that Gaddafi must go. It didn't come from the Libyan people. In February 28th, it was David Cameron who started working on the proposal for a no-fly zone in Libya. That were these types of things were you know carried out without any attempt at diplomacy or dialogue. And in on March 30th of 2011, the New York Times reported that the CIA had been working inside Libya. There were operatives there for several weeks at the time, and so that means they'd been there since mid-February, so around when the protests had begun, and they were joined by British special forces and MI6 intelligence officers. You know, right as things were kind of kicking off, and so it was again around that mid-February timeframe that Obama signed a secret finding authorizing the CIA to provide arms and other support to Libyan rebels. I think y'all put that in the chat. And so, and other support could mean all sorts of covert actions. USAID had already deployed a team to Libya by early March. So this wasn't a war or an effort that came from the Libyan people. I think is the point here, right? Like the West had its hands all over it, and they had reasons other than respecting the will of the people. And so the rebel leadership, right, in Libya swore that they would oppose foreign boots on the ground. Um, but what we saw, as confirmed by NATO, is that special forces troops from Britain, France, Jordan, and Qatar on the ground in Libya stepped up operations in Tripoli, and other cities to help rebel forces as they conducted their final advance on the Gaddafi regime. Um, and so this, I'm really just scratching the surface, right? There's so much we could really talk about as it relates to Libya, but the myth here is that there's a nationalist, self-sufficient rebel fueled entirely by popular support, which does not exist, right? I see, comrades in the chat talking about U.S. NATO trained and armed jihadist groups that later invaded West Africa became the justification for the expansion to Africa and the current U.S. militarization of African reactionaries and police forces. So true, so true. Um, and so yeah, I mean, I think just to wrap up like this kind of discussion of Libya, absolutely what Comrade Rafiki put in the chat. But in Libya's 1969 revolution, Gaddafi inherited one of the poorest nations in Africa. But by the time he was assassinated by the West, Gaddafi's Libya, or the Libya that Gaddafi was a part of, rather, had turned into Africa's wealthiest nation, and had the highest GDP per capita and life expectancy on the continent. but the Western-backed counter-revolution of 2011, resulted in Libya becoming a failed state and its economy in shambles. People talk about open slave markets in Libya, and really, the demise of that Jamahiriya has resulted in all of the worst case scenarios. All of the Western embassies left. The south of Libya became a haven for you know um, militants, and the northern coast became a center of mass migrant trafficking. Egypt, Algeria, and Tunisia have all closed their borders with Libya, and there's an environment of rampant assassinations, and torture, and all sorts of um, uh, uh, you know terrorism. And like y'all are saying, right? Like this is spread far beyond Libya's borders, um, as far as what's going on in the Sahel. And so this effort in Libya that has this humanitarian spin, but has really just caused all sorts of devastation throughout the continent, or in many parts of the continent. And like Rafiki said, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Dejan. Yeah, this is wide reaching, and it has further, um, I guess, implanted neocolonialism, and like the suppression of the sovereignty and self determination of African people. Um, so yeah, I also wanted to quickly touch on Somalia because under the U.S. led West, or the U.S. led West under the cover of humanitarianism, intervened in Somalia to advance the interests of oil companies, and you know that there were just recently 500 U.S. troops sent to Somalia in May, and a more recent attempt to violate that nation's sovereignty and prevent any robust response to the crises that they're facing. There's a, very well, Somalia faces the worst food crisis in the world, right? Um, but what we've seen from the West is just this further exploitation of its resources, and they've cut economic aid to the country. They've carried out so many drone bombings on behalf or through AFRICOM, and through NATO. And so, what we know is that going back all the way to 1991, right, the U.S. led West has kept Somalia destabilized in a perpetual state of civil war, resulting in something like 1 million deaths, right? And so the West goal in Somalia, kind of with Libya, is to make the country an ungovernable killing ground where Somali people cannot use their own resources to develop their country or deal with famine and droughts and other environmental crises on a national level. What we know is that the West doesn't want a central power in Somalia. Their interest is real, or if they did want one, it has to be completely, pliant or dependent in their eyes. They want to block uh, uh, um, uh, development in that country because Somalia has so many minerals like uranium and things like that. So the U.S. and the West have really brought about the disintegration of the Somalian state and society over the last 3 decades, and they're continuing that through their efforts. So just finally, I wanted to speak a little bit on um, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of the most minerally rich places on Earth. It's really an extractor's paradise because, according to the CIA fact book, the DRC abounds with cobalt, copper, niobium, tantalum, petroleum, industrial and gem diamonds, gold, silver, zinc, manganese, tin, uranium, coal, hydropower, and timber. And all of those resources are exploited by Western multinational corporations that maintain their own mercenary armies to guard the extraction fields. And for generations, they have run their patches of Congolese land like governments with the support of France, Belgium, the United States, and other powers. And the so called um, Civil War basically gave them full autonomy in the wake of um, Mobutu's demise, right? So we know that the U.S. and Belgium and other Western forces were involved in the destruction of the um, newly independent Congolese state. and were involved in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. But even going to Mobutu, they were involved in taking power once Mobutu was deposed, and as the power of the central government in Kinshasa crumbled. I point to Mobutu because I think that's when we saw a lot of like the decentralization of control, and so there was mass carnage, and but that didn't interrupt the extraction process in the DRC. So we know that the Rwandan uh, forces under Paul Kagame and the Ugandan forces under Yoweri Museveni invaded Eastern Congo like 13 years ago, and since that time, something like 6 million people have died. So we know that the DRC has probably the highest death toll in terms of what we've seen because those forces are supported by the U.S., right? Bill Clinton, who stood aside when the Rwandan genocide was taking place, presided over a far bigger mass murder in the Congo, right? And he only apologized for one of those deaths. He took a visit to the capital of Rwanda, Kigali, and said that we come here today partly in recognition of the fact that we in the United States and the world community did not do as much as we could have done and should have done to try to limit what occurred. But they're from where I stand, they're supporting the Rwandan and the Ugandan forces in terms of the devastation that's taking place over there. But what they said had occurred is not over, right? The bloodshed has spread rapidly to eastern Congo and has been unleashed by U.S. surrogate forces, and it continues. And Paul Kagame has served U.S. imperial ambitions well, and he helps destabilize Congo with his forces, and so those multinational corporations continue to operate their own airstrips and communications networks, and their patches of Congo proceed like business as usual, while the death toll mounts. And what we've seen as well is that Washington and the NATO powers have shifted policy from indirectly backing, proxies like the Uganda and Rwanda supported rebels to professionalizing, the Congolese troops, the Central Armed Forces, the FARDC. And so, George W. Bush, while he was president, introduced a DRC security sector reform program, which included hiring the private contractor, Canberra Corporation, and the Bush administration's urge to professionalize and legitimize the FARDC coincided with China's growing activities in the country. Um, there was a document, a U.S. military document. It's like a Fort Benning Training and Doctrine Command, a document that came out in 2007 that said China signed an agreement with the DRC in which China provided $5 billion for infrastructure improvements in exchange for rights to DRC's natural resources. And so now that China was in DRC, they were suddenly talking about human rights and humanitarianism and traceable supply lines and things like that. And so that's when they kind of ramped up this training of the Congolese military forces, which also coincided with the passing of Dodd-Frank in 2010 in the U.S., which required the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to mandate companies to verify supply chains. So, in that same year, AFRICOM facilitated the U.S. DRC military partnership, and the objective was to transform the FARDC, among other things, for internal security operations. And so, even more recently, right, 750 soldiers graduated in what AFRICOM describes as a model for future reforms within the Congolese armed forces. Um, and they revealed the creation of a new 391st Commando Battalion. Um, and John Peter Malengo, who's the Congolese commander of training at the camp base, said that in 2006, uh, the Bush promised of transformation of the Congolese armed forces. And so, what we have to understand is that, U.S. militarization of the continent, as U.S. involvement. Well, we just have to understand that as a form of neocolonialism, and any effective strategy for achieving our liberation and countering neocolonialism is really just building popular or grassroots, people-centered, participatory democratic processes from the bottom up, and what we're doing here in terms of working towards the coordination of our various forces that are doing that work. So just to speak on that a little bit. Um, oh, and I was supposed to show a different slide. But yeah, this is just speaking to the examples in Libya and Somalia and the DRC in terms of AFRICOM's focus on making sure that the resources are easily accessible to these corporations. And then we also say about the AFRICOM is the recolonization of Africa by the U.S. Um, and we also are clear that our work, or the work to shut down AFRICOM, and close all U.S. foreign and NATO bases, is key in the effort to demilitarize the world, because we know that Western-led efforts to at militarization are impediments to our struggles for liberation. Um, so I did want to speak briefly about like how I see our fight for self-determination, right? Like we understand that self-determination is the ability of you know any community or nation, or group of people to forge its own path of development, right? And that can't exist when we're dealing with neocolonialism. We're dealing with U.S., EU, NATO domination, right? And so we see that as key to struggle against. Also, just quickly, we understand that NATO expansion has become an existential threat, right, to African people and all oppressed and colonized people around the world. And so, we believe in peace, right? And when we say peace, we don't mean the absence of conflict, right? But we mean the achievement by popular struggle and by self-defense of a world liberated from, you know, imperialism and global aggression and patriarchy and colonialism and white supremacy. So I think it's important for us to understand that we are fighting for a world in which the axis of domination, the U.S. EU NATO axis of domination, is halted, and a world in which NATO is dismantled. A united Africa that's able to uh, um, you know uh, develop it and build on its own terms, right? And so that we see our efforts as a contribution to the work to build that world. And so part of our work, part of our efforts, is that every October the Black Lines for Peace and the U.S. Out of Africa Network organize an international month of action against AFRICOM, and with the aim of raising the public's awareness about NATO and the U.S. military existence in Africa, um, and how NATO forces exacerbate violence and instability throughout the continent. We call for the dismantling of NATO and AFRICOM and all imperialist structures. We believe that Africa and the rest of the world can't be free until all people have a right to sovereignty and the right to live free of domination. So that's all I wanted to share with y'all. Um, I appreciate these comments in the chat. This is dope. I'll definitely get in contact with you, Dejan, about BAP and the U.S. Out of Africa Network. But yeah, Gaddafi's son is supposed to run it. I saw that too. Yeah, it's interesting. I think we need to be watchful, just because Libya. I think the situation is very decentralized, and the power has been distributed to many different forces throughout the country. But anyway, I appreciate y'all for listening to me, um, and hope to build with y'all moving forward. Yep, thank you. Thanks for being on here, Monty. Thank you, Erica and Dejan. All right.